Good evening. For those of you that I do not know, my name is Joanne Drake. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer for the Reagan Foundation, and I want to welcome you here this evening. It is our custom to have you stand and join us in the pledge to the flag in honor of all the men and women who wear the uniform of this country and serve us around the world. So if you would please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Be seated. Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and on behalf of the entire foundation, I'm very honored to introduce to you one of the most decorated speakers we've ever hosted at this library. There are several words to describe him: writer, soldier, teacher, ambassador, reporter, traveler, state legislator, congressman, businessman, and certainly a proud Texan. His story is not that of a typical American. His history of public service began in the early days of the 1960s, where as a college student, he volunteered in George H.W. Bush's first successful election to Congress in 1966 from Harris County, Texas. As far as his military service goes, I think I read somewhere that his mother said his first time serving in the Navy was in utero, when she was a line officer serving as a communicator. Charles Untermeyer began his official Navy service commissioned under the Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps program, where he served in the Navy during the Vietnam War as an officer aboard the Pacific Fleet destroyer USS Benner, and then as an aide and flag lieutenant to the late Rear Admiral Draper Kaufman, who was commander of U.S. naval forces in the Philippines. Chase's career in writing began when he became a political reporter, or should I say his official writing career, when he was a reporter for the Houston Chronicle in 1971. And in 1976, he was elected to his first 2 terms as a U.S. congressman. He continued with his writing career, though, by contributing to the memoirs on George H.W. Bush's life that helped formulate the former president's first autobiography called Looking Forward in 1987. Even today, you can find one of Chase Untermeyer's essays in the Memorial Examiner or the Texas Monthly, and all the while, he still contributes to the Houston Chronicle. His accomplishments in writing, however, begin to make sense when you realize he's been a devoted diarist since the age of 9. And the reason Chase Untermeyer has come today is to give us a special personal insight on his spectacular new book called Inside Reagan's Navy, a diary of sorts. It's a remarkable account of his time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy from 1984 to 1988. Yes, during Ronald Reagan's administration. He is in distinguished company in this regard, as this position at the Pentagon has been held by the likes of both Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, as well as a man named Ralph Austin Bard, I should say. And for those of you that don't know Ralph Austin Bard, he was an advisor to President Harry Truman, noted for a memorandum he wrote to Secretary of War Henry Stimson in 1945, urging that Japan be given a warning before the use of the atomic bomb on a strategic city, becoming the only person known to have formally dissented from the use of the atomic bomb without advance warning. But I digress. I apologize. The book we are going to hear about today begins as Chase Untermeyer is in the midst of leaving the familiarities of being an assistant to Vice President Bush from 1981 to 1983, a position where he was able to, and I quote, travel to every continent except Antarctica and meet some of the most prolific men and women in the world, such as Margaret Thatcher, Emperor Hirohito of Japan, and Pope John Paul II. Later in the book, you as the reader become aware of the exceptional demeanor of the man 3 different US presidents have called upon for service. And I quote Chase later, "As glamorous as this was and as grateful as I was, my job held little substance. I became increasingly and painfully aware that others were governing the United States, and I was not. With mounting intensity, I resolved to leave the Vice President's office for a spot elsewhere, that would give me responsibility for policies and programs to advance the administration's agenda. He's a self-described Bushie, and he first met George H.W. Bush as a 17-year-old when the president was chairman of the Republican Party a few years ago. Fast forward just a few years, and he was appointed to decorated positions by Ronald Reagan, as well as both President Bush 41 and President Bush 43. He was appointed twice by George Bush Sr. to executive assistant positions, including the director of the Voice of America, and as ambassador to Qatar by George W. Bush. It goes without saying that his input was valued by some of the most powerful men in the world. Following his government service, he went on to private industry to do some nonprofit work, to work in higher education, and there were a couple more stints in the government interspersed in there. Honestly, don't think there's any industry in this country, except maybe professional basketball, that Chase has not served in. And we know he has held both elected and appointed offices at all 4 levels of government: local, state, national, and international. He is here to give us his up-close and personal account of his time at the Pentagon, where every day he affected or was affected by nearly 1 million sailors and Marines and 1/3 civilian workers. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome Chase Untermeyer.
Well, thank you, Joanne. And after an introduction like that, I don't think that there is much left to say about my biography. I should say that I have not had the honor of being a member of Congress. I was a member of the Texas legislature, and we in Texas do think of that as the Congress of the former Republic of Texas. But I like the sound of it, so I'm grateful for that. You know, coming here to the Reagan Library is like Broadway for anybody who has been in government service in the last several Republican administrations, and in particular that of President Reagan. As Joanne well said, I did not come into the Reagan White House on day one after the 1981 inauguration as a Reaganite. I was a Bushie. That is, given the fact that I had been, as a rising junior in college, a volunteer in the George Bush for Congress campaign in 1966. And he was elected on the same day that Ronald Reagan was elected governor of this great state. And there began parallel lives. Their lives, of course, filled with great drama, great responsibility, and the grateful affection of the entirety of American voters. On a more humble basis, I began my time by going to Washington as an intern, a congressional intern with freshman Congressman Bush. That is a very thrilling thing to do. In my view, the only way to go to Washington is either as a top-level official or as an intern. That is, you get all the excitement in both levels, and in between are all those hundreds of thousands of other people who do good work, but I don't think have quite the same thrill as the senior official and the intern. Now, when I showed up in the House of Representatives as a lowly staffer in 1967 with 434 other people who were equally thrilled to be walking around the Capitol and learning so much, I was different in that, unbeknownst to me, the boss I was working for would 22 years later become President of the United States, and 30 years later be the father of a President of the United States. That was much in the future. But I'm glad to say that thanks to the friendship and patronage of George H.W. Bush, I had a chance to do many great things. I did have the opportunity to be elected to the Texas legislature from a district near Houston, and that was valuable because too many people who get political appointments in Washington speak very grandly about the voters or citizens or taxpayers without ever having to face them the way a local elected official does. That was an experience that I'm very grateful that I was able to take to the West Wing of the White House with me in 1981 because of that sensitivity to just what ordinary people did feel and say. Frankly, that's not often the case in any administration, in any party, is to have people who have been elected to office, particularly at the local level. In that year, when that was so historic, 1980, the biggest race of all in my world was the third term I was seeking as a member of the Texas legislature. There was another election going on that year, and when it was over, the vice president-elect asked me to join his staff in Washington. Well, I realized this meant the end of whatever active career I had in Texas politics, so I tortured over the decision for 0.2 of a second before accepting the chance to go with him to the West Wing of the White House. Now, this place that I occupied during those exciting early 2 years of the Reagan administration, which is mentioned in my first book called When Things Went Right, the office was about 3 times larger than this rostrum where I'm standing. It truly was closet size. It was historic, like everything in the West Wing is historic, in that it was created by Bryce Harlow, who had, at the time, during the Nixon administration, was the legislative liaison to the president. And he had a young assistant named Lamar Alexander, for whom he created this little office. And Lamar Alexander, who of course later became governor of Tennessee and Secretary of Education and is still in the United States Senate, occupied this tiny space, so tiny that a desk had to be built to fit it. And when on one memorable occasion, the then governor of Texas came to the West Wing, and I wanted to show him a bit of Texana hanging on my wall. The only way the governor could see it would be for me to leave the office and for him to walk in and look at it. But as they say in real estate, the things that matter most are location, location, location. So this tiny closet-like office was, of course, right next to that of the vice president, but on the other side was the chief of staff, and down the hall was the national security advisor, and about 15 seconds a walk in the other direction was the Oval Office. So you can imagine the great thrill for anybody who had read history and always dreamed of at least observing it, if not actually participating in it, to be in that environment at that time. And that's the ambition of these 2 books that Texas A&M Press has kindly published. The first volume, When Things Went Right, about the time I worked at the start of the Reagan administration for Vice President Bush, all the travel that Joanne referred to. And the second volume, which we're talking about this evening, when I did go off to the Pentagon and had a chance to be much more actively engaged. The particular ambition of my time as a diarist is to capture not just the events of the day and what I did during the course of that time, but something of its atmosphere, something of its mood, something of the people that I encountered during the course of that day, which you do through very simple things, very routine, some might even say mundane observations, what the weather was like, what the menu was like, what somebody was wearing, or what they happened to say. And there are people in the literary business who dismiss all that as trivial, and yet I do believe that those are the brushstrokes that add to the canvas, that give you a sense of what it was like to live that moment and to be there. And if you have the chance to read one or both of those 2 books and see or sense what it was like to be in Washington in the 1980s, in those very exciting days with very fascinating and impactful people, then I feel I have succeeded as a diarist. And I might add, a 3rd volume is coming up. The Texas A&M Press at the end of the summer will publish a book called Zenith. It's about the first Bush administration when I went back to the White House after Pentagon service to do the most difficult and unpopular job in national government, I'm convinced, and that is to advise the president on his appointments, the job of Director of Presidential Personnel, and later to go to the Voice of America. It was a time when I, among other things, met my wife-to-be, so that we can claim that we both met in the romantic West Wing of the White House and led to many great things after that. So maybe I'll have a chance to come back and talk about that book. But tonight we're talking about the second volume that's come out about the time when I was honored to be appointed by President Reagan as an Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, I hadn't heard about Secretary Bard and his role that Joanne very interestingly mentioned there. It is true that both Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt had the title of Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but truth to tell, that was back in an earlier era when the Navy Department was a full cabinet department. The Army had its own department as well, the War Department, and there were cabinet secretaries who were very much the rulers of those two realms during all the period of American history right through the Second World War. It was afterwards, in 1947, that the National Defense Act was created and created a Department of Defense that combined the Army and the Navy departments. Before, the two departments were, as much as anything, at loggerheads with each other. And in his remarkable memoirs of that particular period, namely by Henry L. Stimson, who was Secretary of War under Franklin Roosevelt, he said, "Some of the Army-Navy troubles during World War II grew mainly from the peculiar psychology of the Navy Department, which frequently seemed to retire from the realm of logic into a dim religious world in which Neptune was God, Mahan his true prophet, and the United States Navy the only true church." Written by an Army man, of course, but that was very much what the aim was, to create a Department of Defense. And as a result, when that happened, the Navy Department, the Army Department, and the brand new Air Force Department were made subunits of the Department of Defense. They kept these wonderful old titles of Secretary and Assistant Secretary, but it was downscale, shall we say, from the days of TR and FDR when they were number two in a cabinet-level department. That notwithstanding, it still was a very grand thing to be, and particularly for someone like myself who had had the chance to be in active duty in the Navy. That was in a very, very humble capacity as a junior officer during the Vietnam War, in which I served on a destroyer and later was aide to an admiral. Now, I won't go into my war stories other than to say of the second experience when I was aide to the late Admiral Kaufman, who is considered the father of the SEAL community because he was the founder of the underwater demolition teams during the Second World War. A very outstanding man who kindly asked me to be his aide. It meant great experiences, but I must admit to great ineptitude in the role. I was so dazzled by the places we went and the things we did and the people who came to visit us that the things I was really supposed to do, which was to look after the briefcase and the schedule and the hat, were often forgotten. And at one moment of exasperation, Admiral Kaufman said, "You are an aide who needs an aide." And he was absolutely right. And I have to say that one of the gratifying things about becoming an Assistant Secretary of the Navy is that I had a full Marine colonel as my aide, and he knew what to do. Let me give honor, incidentally, to the Marine Corps. The Navy is represented here, but we need to have the Marine flag as well. So for all Marines here, I'm thinking of you. That's something I had to learn to do as a former Navy guy, was to keep saying Navy and Marine Corps, because the Navy Department has both military services under it. And that added to the excitement of being named to be in charge of the personnel aspects of the fleet. And I could well have said, but not anywhere as eloquently, what Winston Churchill said when he was First Lord of the Admiralty on the eve of World War I. He made a trip to Portland, England, where the fleet was anchored. And he happened to arrive at Portland in the evening, and the fleet was all illuminated. And Churchill was moved to say, "Who could fail to work for such a service? Who could fail when the very darkness seemed loaded with the menace of approaching war?" And then, in his great way, he said, "Guard them well, admirals and captains, hardy tars and tall marines, guard them well and guide them true." Well, that kind of feeling of loyalty to a great institution, the United States Navy and Marine Corps, were such that motivated me. But the work to be done happened to be the routine personnel work of a great modern military. That meant things like recruiting and pay and promotions and education and training and women's issues and minority issues and health care. All of this for a rather large force, a force, frankly, twice as large as we have today. That's, of course, because in the 1980s we were reaching the climax of the Cold War, and there were not only great numbers of people still in uniform, but the number of units of the fleet were much larger than today. It was President Reagan's policy, you recall, to have a Navy of 600 ships. That was what he campaigned on in 1980, and he proceeded to be true to his pledge by putting dollars after that pledge and beginning a shipbuilding program which was unprecedented since World War II. The United States, in those years of President Reagan's administration, launched between 20 and 25 ships a year. Today, the number is between 6 and 4, very, very tiny. Now, the modern Navy, the Navy I was able to observe in that magnificent perch you can have at Cabrillo Point in San Diego just a couple of days ago, looking down on San Diego Harbor. The modern Navy is indeed much smaller. It is much more capable in terms of its electronics and firepower, but the fact is that the world has not gotten smaller. The role of the United States around the world has not changed, and the presence of the United States is best expressed by the presence of ships, and has been the case since the days of the early republic. So that there still is a great and unending demand for American naval presence in East Asia, in the Mediterranean, in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, and in the North Atlantic and on our own shores. The world has not changed a bit. It's therefore a matter of concern that the Navy is half the size it was at the time of President Reagan's administration. And that's because at any given time, though the less than 300 ships that we have today are really to be divided into thirds. A third are on a post somewhere in the rest of the world, such as the Mediterranean or East Asia. A third have returned from deployment and are being refitted and sometimes put into the shipyard and the crews refreshed and trained. And then the other third is getting ready to deploy, to relieve those that are on post in overseas posts. So at any given time, whatever the number is, you really need to divide it by 3 to get the actual number of ships that are available to a president in time of crisis to project the strength of the United States. The great force that President Reagan had working for him to build toward, but not quite achieve, a 600-ship fleet in his administration was a remarkable man who I write about at length in my book, and that was John Layman. John Layman was an academic in that he had achieved a doctorate in international affairs. He had been involved in various staffs during prior administrations, and he was and remains a man of great brilliance and great verbal gifts. He was clearly the man to choose to put in charge of that pledge by the president to build up toward to a 600-ship Navy. But it was not easy, and that is typical in any administration. The struggles at the start of an administration over very key positions can be very intense. And in the case of Secretary of the Navy, there was a struggle between those who were supporting John Layman, who had the knowledge and the particular gifts and drive that he has, and a man named Robert Neeson. Now, Robert Neeson was an automobile dealer from somewhere here in Southern California, and he had been a very early supporter of Ronald Reagan for governor. And he had actually driven, and no doubt one of his own cars off a lot, candidate Reagan to various places around the state. And he was a loyalist of undoubted merit, and during the Nixon administration, he had been an Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same kind of position that I held. When time came after the 1980 election to choose Secretary of the Navy, you can imagine the clash at a staff level and other political levels between those who felt that a John Layman with his knowledge should be Secretary of the Navy, and the others who felt here is a man, Robert Neeson, who deserved this position because of his long and loyal service to Ronald Reagan. In the end, the decision went to John Layman, and Robert Neeson was made ambassador to Australia, not a very bad consolation prize, I might add. But I truly think that as disappointing as that must have been to Ambassador Neeson, that President Reagan's choice was absolutely crucial to the defense buildup that characterized his administration. In many ways, the defense buildup was spearheaded by the rebuilding of the Navy and Marine Corps during that time. Also, great things were done for Army and Air Force, but nothing matched what had to be done to rebuild the fleet. And it was John Layman's particular gifts to know about the weapons systems and the ship bottoms and the aircraft and the missile systems. That was all part of the inventory of his remarkable intellect. But more than that, the thing that made him, I believe, the most successful political executive of any department of government in the post-war period was that he knew how to get things done, how to get them through the bureaucracy. You know, it's not enough just to believe in something. It's not enough just to be able to speak about it. It's not enough just to know exactly what to do. It's the bringing together of all those necessities and virtues to actually get a program passed through the Congress of the United States. That is a skill given to very few, but John Layman had it in immense quantities. And he, having the knowledge of Capitol Hill, was able to do all the little tricks that are required in getting something through the Congress. He knew what parts of each weapon system and ship and plane were to be built in somebody's state or congressional district. And he knew exactly which members to go to and tell them what great things would happen to their state or their district if this particular ship or plane was to be built. He knew the times when you relented and pulled back from something you might want to do if that gave the member of Congress a chance to claim great glory or victory in a dispute with the Navy Department over some kind of contract or personnel decision. Many things that he was able to do in the Congress behind the scenes to get the program passed and to get the appropriations to build the ships are a remarkable story. And I tried to tell as much of his gifts as I could without actually being there all the time to see him do it. I bet that there were probably things even more amazing that he did that I never saw that are to his credit. Now, readers of this book will see that he was not the perfect boss. That this often happens, doesn't it? That people who have strong gifts in one area don't always have them in another. And working for him was often very frustrating to try to find out what was going on and what was expected of me. And just trying to see him to get a appointment on the schedule was often challenging. And one day when I made mention of that, Secretary Layman said, well, you know, once when I was working for Henry Kissinger in the Nixon White House, I complained to him that I could not get on his schedule. And Kissinger said to me, if you think you need an appointment to see me, you will always need an appointment to see me. So that meant you had to take the target of opportunity and grab the secretary when you could. And many times I also decided on that other piece of wisdom, which is it's easier to seek forgiveness than permission. So I would just go ahead and do things and take whatever consequential responsibility came as a result of that. Well, I don't want to emphasize the negative because, as I say, the overall strength and drive and genius of John Layman is what made it possible for the United States Navy to be rebuilt during those years to fulfill President Reagan's pledge and arguably make a very crucial difference in the winning of the Cold War. When John Layman stepped down as Secretary of the Navy, he was succeeded by another amazing personality, quite a different person, whom I describe in detail, and that was Jim Webb. Jim Webb, a recipient of the Navy Cross for heroism during the Vietnam War as a Marine, an author, a novelist of great repute, whose book, The Fields of Fire, is considered perhaps the finest literary achievement to come out of the Vietnam War. He had served in congressional staffs and had been a celebrated boxer at the Naval Academy, in which he lost a famous round to Ollie North, another name out of those years. Jim Webb, whom I got to know because President Reagan had first appointed him Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs, and Reserve Affairs were part of my portfolio, became Secretary of the Navy at a point at which he had decided to leave and go off and write some more novels. But Caspar Weinberger, who I revere, prevailed upon him to consider succeeding John Layman as Secretary of the Navy, and President Reagan, of course, accepted Secretary Weinberger's recommendation and duly appointed Jim Webb. Jim Webb, perhaps because of his very romantic spirit, believing very much in his personal family heritage as a soldier, someone who had fought, someone from his family had fought in every war that America had had since colonial times. And he saw himself very much as the exemplar of American service in uniform. And as a result, he felt himself a great deal of loyalty toward the enlisted man and woman who actually had to be the one to be in the front lines and defend the country. I must say that Jim Webb was another difficult boss to work for, and without mentioning the negatives too much there, because they're in the book, I do believe that he accomplished a great deal during what became a very brief period. He was secretary for only 10 months. At the end of that time, he did something that's very rare in American government. He resigned on a matter of principle. The principle was that he was charged by the man who appointed him to build up toward 600 ships. We were about 586, if I remember the number, as of that time, when the then Secretary of Defense, Frank Carlucci, who had succeeded Caspar Weinberger, made a budgetary decision to cut back on the Navy shipbuilding budget. There was a clash between the two of them. Of course, the Secretary of Defense would win that clash, and Jim Webb resigned. This is unusual in American politics because there is something about us as Americans that we're told that if you're given a job, you finish the job. The idea that a public official would resign at all for anything other than some scandal or moral issue is still quite unusual in our politics. It happens quite frequently in British politics, where an aspiring politician wants an issue to resign over because that then gives you a mark of honor. Secretary Webb was very much a man of honor. In fact, he wrote a novel called A Sense of Honor to tell about the U.S. Naval Academy, where he was a graduate. And yet, there are those in Washington who will always question the motives or undercut people who do that sort of thing that is very unusual. And he was thought of by many as someone who had walked away from his job. In later years, Secretary Webb became U.S. Senator from Virginia and was briefly a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president this year. I have the utmost admiration for him, and he remains, I believe, the most amazing, colorful person I have ever met. And he certainly was one of the dominant figures of the 1980s and the Reagan administration. I should say as a footnote that when he ran for Senate in Virginia as a Democrat, which surprised a lot of people, but he did. He was running against George Allen, incumbent Republican senator, very popular. And when the Webb poll numbers were rising, the Allen campaign began to make much of the fact that he had resigned as Secretary of the Navy, had, in their words, walked out on President Reagan. Well, the Webb campaign struck back by having a clip of the speech that President Reagan gave at the 1986 graduation of the Naval Academy, in which he singled out James Webb, who then was his Assistant Secretary of Defense, for being an exemplary graduate of the Naval Academy. And when that was done, it killed the argument on the Allen campaign to have Ronald Reagan himself, in effect, speaking up for Jim Webb. Let me bring this general recollection to a close by mentioning that the big job that I had, as I mentioned, was very much engaged with personnel. A lot of policy issues over big questions like what retirement benefits should be and the role of women in uniform. And then there were truly thousands of administrative decisions that fell to me by direction of the Secretary of the Navy over such things as the correction of records, the correct awarding of decorations, and the administration of justice. One of the great strengths of the American military justice system is that there is a provision that says that the decision of a court-martial cannot be carried out until all appeals have been exhausted and until the secretary of that military service or his or her designee, and that was me, will enter final judgment. That is, after something has gone through all the chain of command and gone over into the Court of Military Appeals, it goes to the desk of the service secretary or the designee for final action. And the power of that individual is, as the lawyers say, plenary. It involves every power other than the power to increase the sentence so that the service secretary can validate the sentence, can probate it, can reduce it, can dismiss the charge, can do anything at that particular point in the justice system. For this role, which I took extremely seriously, I had a group of lawyers on my staff, and they were backed up by the Judge Advocates General of the Navy and Marine Corps. They would prepare cases for me, and then I would review those cases. This is something I did on Sundays. I was single at the time, and I could just devote entire days to going to the office without meetings, without telephone calls, and any other interruption, and to read through these cases and enter my judgment, where, as I said, the power was complete. I didn't have to share it with anybody else. I had that particular authority. And I did feel that the significance of that was very much a heritage of the view that the civilians are ultimately responsible for the not just oversight of the military in how it does its job, but also in protecting the liberties and rights of even the humblest and lowliest member of any of the military services. That was the reason that a civilian service secretary or designee had the final say in that entire military justice system. I felt that the significance of that was not that I was a lawyer, because I was not a lawyer, not that I had been in uniform myself, although I had served in uniform, but purely the fact that I was a civilian appointed by the President of the United States, by the Commander-in-Chief. That was what gave me the authority and the responsibility to rule as well, as wisely as I could on these cases affecting the lives of these service personnel and their extended families. Every time I did that, when I entered a judgment on a case, I could almost truly feel the mandate of the American people rising through the election of Ronald Reagan twice as President of the United States, and in the election of 100 U.S. senators who had to vote on my confirmation, down to the tip of my pen, that I truly felt that I was acting because I was the ultimate responsible party of the American people in protecting the military. It was an awesome responsibility, one I took very seriously, and I must say that I was given a special inspiration by none other than Herman Melville. Now, Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, also wrote a remarkable book called White Jacket, and it is the semi-fictionalized account of his time 1 year as an ordinary seaman on the United States frigate, United States. In those days, the naval vessels went out for a year or two and hit very few ports. And one of the reasons they hit very few ports is that conditions on those ships were so awful for the men before the mast that if given the chance, they would truly jump ship. They would go over the side and swim for shore to get away. And I might add, one of the responsibilities of the United States Marine Corps in those days was to have a group of armed Marines on board every vessel to maintain order. And during such times in port, they were stationed in the rigging and would shoot the sailors who were deserting and going ashore. Well, Herman Melville, after his celebrated time of following the whales, was in Hawaii at a time when this frigate, the United States, dropped anchor, and there were several sailors who took the opportunity to jump ship. Some made it, some didn't, but what was needed was to get a crew member to fill in behind at least one of those sailors. Herman Melville wanted a free trip back to Massachusetts, and he enlisted on the spot. He was taken in as an ordinary seaman and spent a year getting from there to Nantucket. It was a result of his experiences, seeing what life was really like, and it was really grim for sailors in those days, that powered his writing this book called White Jacket, which is a novel I really recommend. And it helped to do many things in getting reforms of the way that ordinary sailors were treated, in particular the abolition of flogging as a defense mechanism, disciplinary mechanism. And he wrote words in his book, White Jacket, that spoke to me. 130 years later, I felt that Herman Melville was talking to me, given the responsibility that I described to you. He said that the Army is sometimes remodeled, but the Navy goes down from generation to generation almost untouched and unquestioned, as if its code were infallible and itself a piece of perfection that no statesman could improve. When a Secretary of the Navy ventures to innovate upon its established customs, you hear some of the Navy officers say, "What does this landsman know about our affairs? Did he ever head a watch? He does not know starboard from larboard, girt line from backstay." And this is Melville. While we deferentially and cheerfully leave to Navy officers the sole conduct of making or shortening sail, tacking ship, and performing other nautical maneuvers as may seem to them best, let us be aware of abandoning to their discretion those general municipal regulations touching the well-being of the great body of men before the mast. Let us beware of being too much influenced by their opinions in matters where it is but natural to suppose that their long-established prejudices are enlisted. Well, Herman was being a little tougher on the Navy and Marine officers of his time than I would be, but the point is the same. That is, that it is given to the civilians to watch out over the men and women who are in our nation's uniform. That was a role I was most honored to perform. And looking back on that very exciting four-year period when I was able to be an assistant secretary in Ronald Reagan's Navy, that is the thing that gives me the greatest satisfaction. And I will make a final point, and that is that ever after, I was never sued in federal court over a decision that I rendered. And I count that to the fact that I could actually make those decisions and sleep well at night knowing that I had done what was expected of me. Well, I'm going to stop at this point and let Joanne get back to this podium, which she did so well, and take your questions.
So we do have a few minutes if we have some questions, and so I want to start actually while you're forming your questions with my own question. I'm wondering if you could tell us your best day at the Pentagon and your worst.
Thank you, yes. I would say the best day came on a particular day when things seemed to be quiet, and I was reading through the weekly publication called the Navy Times. And this is a publication that then and now probably talks about big issues, but also smaller personnel issues. And to my astonishment, I saw an article there that said that the Surgeon General of the Navy had decided no longer to provide free over-the-counter medicines to Navy families, things like aspirin and cough syrup and some kind of medicines for babies. And this is something that the Surgeon General was one of my military counterparts who I worked with, and had never mentioned this to me. And I could see immediately the effects on morale, particularly for families when their husbands were deployed for many, many months, and the mom was back taking care of the kids, and the kid may have had a cold, to be told that then you'd had to pay more to get that kind of cough syrup or whatever else it may be. So I first of all called Secretary Layman to make sure he hadn't done this without telling me. He said he hadn't, and that if I could get a piece of paper to him, he would revoke the rule. So happily, the rule was revoked, and we were able to get it to the Navy Times before the next edition showed up that would have talked about this particular problem. And I consider that a good day because it was a bureaucratic moment. But where I wished I could have been on that day was at sea somewhere, perhaps on an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf, and watched the takeoff and recovery of aircraft and had lunch on the mess decks with sailors and learned a lot. That would have been a wonderful day. But the real job was back at my desk, taking care of that little issue that could have become a much bigger issue and harm morale and restricted reenlistments and all the other things for which I really did have responsibility. Worst day, I guess, would have to be after, and this was in May of 1987, when one of our frigates, the USS Stark, was hit by an Iraqi missile. This was before the U.S. had direct conflict with Iraq, but needless to say, there was high tension in that particular period in those waters. If I remember, something like 34 sailors were killed. The ship didn't sink, but it was severely injured and was towed back to port. On the day that I'm thinking of, I arrived thinking that I had a regular routine schedule, but I was told that Secretary Webb had to testify on the Hill on very important appropriations matters that day, and that I had to represent the Navy Department leadership at Dover Air Force Base at the funeral or the memorial for the sailors who were brought back in flag-draped caskets. You know, this is something that presidents have to do. President and Mrs. Reagan did so beautifully, so brilliantly, but I think it must be the most painful thing that we ask presidents to do. And I, on that particular day, had the lesser but still intense experience of having to face the surviving spouses and children and parents of those sailors killed. And the lesson I took from that is that on those occasions, there's nothing you can say, and so therefore there's no words that I recommend to people to say. It's just being there and showing solidarity and support that makes that moment survivable.
Okay. I think we had a couple of questions over here, right here. Now, before you ask the question, if you would wait to have a microphone so that we are recording it properly, right here.
Yes, you have extensive experience in personnel at the highest levels, in organization and policies. Two things based on that extensive experiences you have, how could we quicker and more effectively reorganize the VA so the men can be served actually then by words, by deed? And also there's so much talk all the time about reforming the Pentagon. That's a nice thing to throw out there, but I'm not sure what they're talking about. And if you were asked to do that, what would your suggestions be?
I'm going to combine both of those questions into one, which is how you get things done through bureaucracies. And I might add, this is probably true of corporate bureaucracy as much as government. I'm convinced that it isn't the structure, it isn't the department or the name of the company that makes the difference. It's always people. Now, this seems like a very simple-minded thing to say, but the fact is that in government, in particular, we always think of structure and moving the boxes around, whereas I'm convinced all the more that if you get the right people, the ones who are smart enough to know what to do and courageous enough and energetic enough to go do it, and we'd like to add, in the case of the VA, sensitive enough to why they were there, which is to take care of people with real problems rather than just filling out paper, that if you get people like that, then you can make things happen. And I mentioned the case of Secretary Layman, at the very highest level, somebody who had the skill set and the opportunity to actually get things done. That's an outstanding example, to say the least. But in the case of an agency like the VA or elsewhere in the Department of Defense, once again, if you get the right people, it doesn't matter what the structure is, that they will make it work and they will get the job done. And you could have the opposite, the most brilliant structure, but the wrong people, and you won't get anything done. And so in the most recent scandal over VA, I know there's been a lot of scurrying around and a lot of talk about changing and reforming that agency, but my guess is, in the end of the day, once again, if you get a motivated boss who's able to pick the right people who know what to do and go forth to do it, then you have a chance of making progress.
Okay, I see that it's after 7, so Chase has agreed to do a book signing in our gift bookstore. If you do not have a book, we have them available or in the store. If you have questions as you're going through the line, I know he'd be happy to answer them.
Yes.
He's also willing to personalize your book, so come up with your question. We'll meet you over there, give us a minute, and we'll get him all set up. And I want to thank you on behalf of everybody here at the Foundation and the Board of Trustees, and thank you for your service to this country most of all. It is quite remarkable.
We'll do that.